Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk to you about one of the biggest economic problems facing Russia right now, inflation. Now, if you've been following what's been going on in the Russian economy over the past few years, you'll know that inflation has become one of the defining challenges of the wartime economy. It's one of the main reasons why interest rates were pushed to extraordinary levels. And it's one of the main reasons why economic growth is now slowing down, and why businesses and consumers across Russia continue to feel pressure despite all of the claims that the economy remains strong. Now, on the surface, things appear to be improving. The latest official data shows that inflation in Russia fell to 5.3% in May, which was down from 5.6% in April, which was the lowest reading since 2023. And if you just look at those headline numbers, you might conclude that the Bank of Russia is finally winning the battle. But when you start digging beneath the surface, a very different picture begins to emerge, because although inflation officially is running at 5.3%, inflation expectations remain above 12%. Producer prices are now sitting at around 10% increase year on year. Interest rates are still extraordinarily high. Labour shortages are continuing. Military spending remains elevated. And Russia is facing fuel shortages in parts of the economy despite being one of the world's largest energy producers. So in this episode, I want to look at whether the official inflation numbers are really telling us the whole story, because there are some very serious warning signs appearing beneath the surface, and they suggest that inflation may not be anywhere near as under control as the headline figures imply. Now, before we get into the details on all of this, could I ask anyone that's enjoying these videos to please give me a thumbs up for this one and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really does help me with the YouTube algorithm, and of course also puts a smile on my face. Now, before we get into the latest numbers, let's start with the inflation target itself. One of the things that often surprises people is that Russia's inflation target is not 2%. In the UK, the United States, the Eurozone, central banks are all targeting inflation of around that level, 2%. Russia's target is 4%. And the reason why it's double everybody else's is relatively straightforward. The Russian economy has historically struggled to maintain the sort of low inflation levels seen in Western economies. Inflation has traditionally been a lot more volatile. The ruble has often experienced significant swings. Commodity prices play a much larger role, and government spending has tended to be more cyclical. As a result, the Bank of Russia concluded years ago that maintaining inflation at 2% on a sustained basis would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. So instead, it adopted a target rate of 4%. But even that higher target is proving difficult to achieve. At 5.3% in May, inflation remains more than 30% above the target level. And that's after some of the most aggressive interest rate policies seen anywhere in the world. At one stage, the Bank of Russia increased interest rates to 21%. Even today, rates remain extraordinarily high by international standards at 14.25%. To put that into context, you have to go back decades in most developed economies to find comparable levels. For most people in the UK, America, or Europe, double-digit interest rates are something associated with economic history books rather than modern monetary policy. Yet Russia has been operating under these conditions for an extended period, and that alone tells us something important. If inflation was genuinely under control, interest rates would not need to remain at elevated levels. The central bank clearly believes inflation risks are still significant. And perhaps the biggest clue comes from inflation expectations. Now, inflation expectations are an incredibly important metric because they tell us what ordinary people in Russia think is happening to prices. So this isn't put together by economists or politicians or statisticians. It's from consumers, workers, and families, the people who are actually paying bills. And the latest survey shows Russian household inflation expectations are running at around 13% in May before easing slightly to 12.4% in June. Now, if we just think about that for a second, official inflation is 5.3%, but consumers are expecting inflation of 12.4%. That is a massive 7% gap, and it's existed for a long time. If we look back over the last period since the war started, the expectations have always been ahead of the actual inflation. Now, there are several possible explanations here. The first is that people naturally focused on most of the things that they buy more often, things like food, fuel, utilities, and rent. And if those items are rising faster than overall basket used by statisticians, consumers will feel that inflation is higher than the official number. The second possibility is that inflation expectations reflect years of inflation shocks. People have become conditioned to expect higher prices because they've repeatedly experienced them. But there's also a third possibility, and that is that the official statistics may not fully capture what people are actually experiencing on the ground. Now, I'm not suggesting there's a giant conspiracy theory here, but in any economy undergoing sanctions, war spending, labour shortages, supply disruptions, and heavy state intervention, measuring inflation accurately is quite difficult. The reality on the ground can diverge significantly from the official averages. And that's where producer prices become particularly interesting, because producer prices, also known as factory gate prices, often act as an early warning system. They measure the costs businesses are facing before those costs reach consumers. So it's the price when that good is leaving the factory before it gets to the stores and actually on the shelves, and the new price appears. And what we're seeing right now is really concerning. Throughout late 2025 and early 2026, producer prices were actually falling on an annual basis. November figures were negative, as were December, January, February, and March. So year on year, producer prices were actually going down. The price of goods leaving factories in Russia was lower than it was the year before. So there appeared to be a degree of cost relief moving through the system. But recently everything has changed. In April, producer prices jumped by 5.5%. That means that the price of goods leaving Russian factories in April were 5.5% higher than they were in April 2025. And in May, they've accelerated to 9.4%, which is the highest level since the start of 2025. Now, that is a remarkable shift. And perhaps even more important is the gap that now exists between producer prices and consumer inflation. Producer prices are up by 9.4% in May. Consumer inflation is only 5.3%. So we're talking about a 4.1% difference. Historically, that sort of divergence rarely lasts forever. Eventually, businesses have to decide whether they absorb those higher costs or pass them on. Now, when we're talking about producer prices, that's basically the factory gate prices. So those companies will be selling at a higher level, and it's down to then the retailers or whoever's actually selling the products to decide whether they're going to bear those costs. They're not. And if margins are already under pressure, the answer is obvious. The costs get passed on, which means today's producer price inflation of 9.4% should become tomorrow's consumer price inflation. And that's why economists watch those numbers so closely. They're often a glimpse of what's coming. And when you combine that with the double-digit inflation expectations, it becomes harder to believe the inflation battle in Russia has now been won. Now let's talk about what's driving these cost pressures, because much of it comes back to the structure of the wartime economy. Since the invasion of Ukraine, government spending in Russia has surged. Defense manufacturers have expanded production, military contractors have hired workers aggressively, factories linked to the war effort have received huge state orders, and that has created enormous competition for labour. Russia already had demographic challenges before the war. It's got an ageing population, low birth rates, a shrinking workforce, and when you add military mobilisation, emigration, and rapidly growing defence production into the mix, the result is exactly what basic economics would predict. Labour shortages, and when businesses compete for a limited pool of workers, wages rise. Now that might sound positive if you're a worker, but if wages rise faster than productivity, companies eventually have to increase their prices, and that creates inflation. In effect, Russia has been experiencing a classic wartime overheating problem. Government spending boosts demand, labour becomes scarce, wages rise, costs increase, therefore prices increase. The central bank then responds by increasing interest rates to tackle inflation, and that's exactly what we've been seeing over the past few years. But now another complication is emerging: energy prices. The war in Iran has pushed global oil and gas prices much higher. Every time energy prices rise, inflationary pressures increase across the global economy. Transport becomes more expensive, manufacturing goes up in price, Heating is just more expensive because you're having to pay for that increase in the fuel. Therefore, electricity also rises in cost, and those costs eventually feed through into everything. At the same time, Russia has been facing domestic fuel market pressures. Authorities have restricted exports of gasoline and banned them, and other fuels, such as jet fuel, to prioritise domestic supply. And whenever shortages emerge, prices go up. That's basic economics. If there's a shortage of something and people want to still buy it, then the price will rise. That's how markets operate. Limited supply combined with steady demand creates upward pressure on prices. So we have multiple inflationary forces operating simultaneously here. Wage inflation, labour shortages, producer price inflation, energy inflation, and elevated inflation expectations. Yet we're also being told inflation is moving steadily down in Russia. This is where the story becomes really quite interesting because the various indicators are no longer sending the same message. Some are suggesting inflation is easing, others are suggesting inflation risks are extremely elevated. And when indicators begin diverging like this, economists start asking questions. Is the official inflation rate understating what's happening? Are producer prices warning of another inflation wave? Will inflation expectations pull actual inflation higher? Or is the central bank successfully engineering a soft landing? The honest answer at this stage is that we don't actually know. But what we do know is that the Russian economy is slowing down. Even Russian government forecasts for growth have been downgraded significantly as high interest rates and economic pressures begin to bite. And that creates a major dilemma for policymakers. Cut rates too quickly and inflation will accelerate. Keep rates too high and economic growth will weaken further. It's a really difficult balancing act, and right now it appears to becoming even more difficult. So while the headline inflation number may look encouraging, the broader picture remains far more complicated. Inflation expectations are over 12%, producer prices are almost at 10%, labour shortages remain, energy markets are volatile, and the economy continues to face the distortions created by wartime spending. When you take all of these factors together, these indicators suggest that inflation remains one of the biggest threats to Russia's economic stability. And if producer price inflation starts feeding through into consumer prices over the coming months, we may discover that the inflation story is far from over. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, I really appreciate that support. I genuinely do. So thank you so much.